Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the podcast. We have a really fun conversation today. Tomorrow, if you're in the future, one of our guests is in the future. We don't know where we are right now, but we're going to have a good conversation. I have Joel and Chris with me today. Chris is in China. Joel is in North Carolina. Scott is in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. And we're going to talk K-12 leader development. It's a conversation we haven't had on the podcast, so I'm super excited to learn a little bit more about how these two are thinking about this work. But Chris, I'm going to turn it to you, our friend in the future. What do listeners need to know about you, sir, before we jump into the heart of the conversation?
Great. Thanks so much, Scott. We're really excited for this conversation, and I've been a fan of your podcast for pretty much its entire existence. So a lot of people I admire and read about their work have been on this podcast, so I'm a little bit awed and humbled to be here myself. So I've been in education for my career in a variety of settings, mainly private schools. This is my third continent I've worked on. I've been in America, been in Europe, and now I'm in China. So 6 schools across my career, a variety of styles and shapes. But what I became passionate about pretty early on was the side of schools that's not often focused on. So you might think of dean of students roles. Now we're getting a lot more attention for social emotional learning, which wasn't as popular earlier in my career. But I've always had a passion around that. And that kind of stemmed into research and a doctoral program focused on leader development, where I was exposed to this whole world in the adult space that I didn't know existed. And so I've been particularly interested in translating that to the K-12 space so we can increase the leadership capacity for all students everywhere.
Okay, Joel, tell us a little bit about you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Pleasure, Scott. Good to be here with you both and to have this conversation. Yeah, so I've taken a different path than many people in the field of leadership development. In high school and college, I actually taught tennis and taught skiing. And so early on, I got exposed to helping people learn and grow. And when the season came to an end, I found myself actually even at a younger age wanting to help people grow on a deeper journey. Like the sport wasn't enough. Yeah. And then I fell into the field of leadership development when I pivoted from the corporate world and went into the YMCA. And so I was at a YMCA conference and training center, and I started really being introduced to the field of leadership development through a community there that's called the Leadership Forum community. And it's a 107-year-old community now. It was started by the YMCA. The Center for Creative Leadership had history in it, but it introduced me into the field. And through that, I found myself being a part of a group that went to Sri Lanka. So actually, it was my wife and I in that group. So we went to Sri Lanka with the YMCA, and we were world service workers there. Wow. And having been introduced to leadership development, I started doing leadership development over there. My role was to bring it to the 38 YMCAs that were there. That year that my wife and I started our life together over there, the tsunami came through. So that was 2004, 2005. And what I learned over there is we were offering leadership development to young people was the incredible hunger for that.
Wow.
And over there, the question really started to emerge around, boy, what would the world look like if all young people had access to leadership development? And interestingly enough, after I returned and ended up at the Center for Creative Leadership as a part of this group to launch Leadership Beyond Boundaries, I returned early on in my time to CCL and interviewed some of those young people about what helped them respond to the tsunami. And they all pointed back to that opportunity where they were exposed to a little bit of leadership development that enabled them to step up. And so then while I was at CCL, we were talking to senior execs and people, and we kept hearing from people saying, I wish I got this when I was younger.
Yeah.
And so you'd hear these 40-year-olds going through CCL programs and saying, I wish I got this when I was younger. The funny part about this, Chris, is actually I have talked to 14-year-olds going through like a Rotary program. And one of them was just like, man, if I only got this a couple of years ago, I could have done so much more. And so interestingly, Ellen Van Velser, who we talked about just a few minutes ago, before the podcast started, we were talking, and Ellen and I did a little fun study there and reached out and had 462 people that we surveyed through CCL's system globally. And it was somewhere over 90% of them said that all students should have access to leadership development. And in fact, everyone under 95% of the respondents said that before the age of 21, everyone should have access to leadership development. So this message of, I wish I got this when I was younger, and getting it to people earlier can just provide dividends on somebody's lives
Oh,
and
100%.
society.
Oh, 100%. I'm really excited for this conversation because I think to show my cards early, and listeners have heard me say this before, I think one of the Achilles heels as a ski coach or as a tennis coach, or Chris, for you in education, we've scaffolded the learning around, let's say, mathematics, or we've scaffolded the learning around teaching someone violin. Now, it might be the Suzuki method. There's other methods, but at least the learning has been scaffolded in certain paradigms. And I don't know that we've done that. I feel like we're at such a youthful state in our understanding of how to do this work. So I am on board, excited, and just in when it comes to this conversation, because I do think even some of those really kind of simple mental models that people are fed, you have to have a title or a position to lead. If we can break some of those realities down in people's minds when they're young, I think that does a great service. So how are the two of you thinking about this? Joel, why don't you start us off, and then Chris, we'll go to you because I love the fact that we have this combo here, and you all have been working on this topic. So let's jump in.
Yeah. And so just to continue a little bit of the thread that I was talking about, because a couple of other steps in my career took me through growing the work at CCL, growing this line of business, working with a number of schools and universities to develop frameworks. I then ended up going on to UNC here at Chapel Hill, and I got a master's in educational innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship. That's a mouthful. It's called the MIGHTY program, really cool program. And then I've spent time in the corporate world and executive coaching and such. Yeah, with the work that I did at CCL in particular, I've found a couple of things to be really important. And you've talked about these things before, is that there's a lot to explore around differentiating leading self or leader and leadership. And so that noun and verb, if we want to talk about it in that way that people have referenced it. And how do we break some of these concepts down to simplicity? Oliver Wendell Holmes, the quote, I wouldn't give a fig for simplicity or simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my arm anything for simplicity on the other side of complexity. That was a mantra that we used as we started to learn and explore how do we do this in schools. Because what we found out when we did some work with Ravenscroft is we actually went through rounds of research with getting input from the school around what they wanted when they wanted to develop this citizen leader framework down there. And we got input from teachers, from parents, from students. We did all of the discovery work, and we presented this framework to them. And it had 4 components to it. And the teachers were like, whoa, that is way too complex. And so we said, thanks for that feedback. And we went back and we made it a little bit tighter and better so that they could have a common language grounded in some common beliefs. And so the simplicity of thinking about leadership and leader, and then having a consistent language and framework enables the adults in the ecosystem to really support uniformly and develop everyone. There's a lot more to share about some of this, but let's start with that.
Awesome. Okay, Chris, you're on the front lines every day doing this work. What are some things that you're thinking about that maybe build upon what Joel just said?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always had this interest in this side of schools. I was put in charge at one of my school of training the leaders. They called them prefects and proctors at this school. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I'd never taught this before. And so I said, okay, let me call around to some schools that have leadership or leader development in their mission statement. So I started calling these schools and I got these answers that just baffled me in terms of what do you do? Oh, we focus on critical thinking and public speaking. Shouldn't every good school do that? And so it didn't go very far. And I was a little frustrated. At that time, this is mid 2000s, late 2000s. There was one book that was done by Josie Bass in 98 called Youth Leader Development. And it was okay. But I was entering a Ph.D. program at the time at James Madison University. And gratefully, Susan Murphy just arrived at the same time I was starting. So she was head of the program. And that's right about the time she started coming out with great publications. She did a book, Early Development and Leadership, and then this paper, which kind of outlined some of the early influences in leader development. And that research has grown a lot over the last 15 years. Now there's some people I admire. They all seem to come out of, there's a couple different threads, right? CCL does incredible work. A lot seems to go back to Claremont McKenna and Riggio and Day. And there's this guy I admire, Marco Leo, who's at Zhejiang University in China. He did a great paper to outline some of these early signals or developmentally appropriate things that we can do. This research has grown as I've been an administrator in education, and I think that's really exciting. We're at an interesting point. When I started, we had a few off-the-shelf products that were really good. You've got Leader in Me, and you've got the Leadership Challenge, and I have no problem with those. But what I learned is kids get tired of them. You run them once, and they understand it, and that's probably good enough. The ideal is what Joel was doing, and I got to join him on some of his projects with these public school systems or individual independent schools, and they were fantastic to be able to create a customized framework for that institution that incorporates the values of that institution and the resources that they have in that community. But the problem is there's a big gap in price between what most people can afford to pay the CCL, and that's on the one end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum is this off-the-shelf product that's more plug and play, but limited in what you can do with it.
Yep.
So Joel and I started talking a lot about how we could create a customizable translation of some of the research that teachers and parents and educators could pick up and run with it. We realized pretty quickly teachers are pretty busy. And we know this, they don't need another thing. They don't need another program. But if they can have a blueprint to think about leader development in their classroom, using what they're already doing and viewing it through a different lens, that ends up being really powerful. So we created a blueprint that we've been testing out in different environments. I've gotten to share it with my staff and students, and so far successful. So that's how we came to this point. We started thinking about leader development, and we're particularly excited about the next stage and the next evolution of this work.
What are you all thinking about right now based on some of the work that you've done initially?
Sure. So there's two parts to the blueprint, I would say. We call it one slope, and it won't be mind-blowing to any of your listeners who are well steeped in this. But again, the idea is translating the really good research for educators and having them being able to hold on to something that they can incorporate into their classrooms.
Yep.
And so this can be as simple or as complex as they want it to be. And we think of it as 5 buckets of slope. There's self, which understanding and improving how to lead oneself. There's learning, which is bifurcated into kind of continuous learning across all categories of slope. This would be like growth mindset type stuff. And then functional learning for a task-specific application. If you don't know about a particular area, you're not going to be able to do as much in the leadership world about it. And kids intrinsically get this, Scott, because you'll get kids who are very willing to step up in an English classroom or a certain classroom setting, but very reticent on a sports field. And quite the opposite. You'll have a kid who knows, oh, okay, I can try leadership on the lacrosse field a lot more quickly than I'm comfortable doing that in a science classroom. Self-learning others, enhancing one's abilities to understand and manage relationships, better interact and collaborate and lead with others. This is huge. Practice is one of the most important things that we highlight because we feel like it's this muscle, right? This is a quote that gets used. It's a muscle, and the earlier and more you exercise this muscle, the stronger it's going to get. So how can we get kids these reps in the gym earlier in their career so they can start learning, trying, failing, growing from experiences? And that's how leader development happens. And then the last is environment, expanding awareness about the possibilities and challenges of leadership in different contexts, cultures, and systems. We have opportunities. We're shaped by our environments, and we have, depending on how you contextualize environment, we have opportunities to shape it. We're also offered opportunities by our environment and limited by our environment. Some of the opportunities my kids have in China, my students in China, look very different than an opportunity that they would have in the United States. And I quickly learned a project that I might assign someone in the United States is not appropriate in China because of the context and the culture. So you have to, regardless of your age, you're offered constraints and opportunities by your environment. So we call those, that's slope, and we think of them as buckets. And the basic contention to answer this early question I had of what is leader development, right? What is leader development? In schools, what am I doing? Because Susan Murphy had a great quote in her work where she said, pretty much everything can go into the category of leader development because it's human development. And that's completely overwhelming to an educator. So I can do anything and it's leader development? Actually, what is it? So our contention is if you're filling each of these 5 buckets, you are engaged in the process of leader development. And these buckets are never totally full across your lifetime. You can't have an overflowing bucket. You're always learning and growing in each of these areas. But if you are filling each of these buckets, then you are indeed engaged in the process of leader development as an educator or parent or as an individual.
Joel, you're itching to jump in. You're smiling.
Chris and I sitting in my house around an old wooden table, and we're having this conversation around how do we think about scaling this? How do we take what we know and what we've learned and really get it out there so that it can get to all students everywhere? And so Chris said, I think we need a framework. And I'm like, the last thing the world needs is another damn leadership framework. I'm like, no. And he talks me into it. He's just, okay. I'm like, all right, we'll go through the thought exercise, right? Let's go down that road. And so to his credit, as we started going down that road, I thought about the work that I'd done. I'd built out frameworks in multiple different schools, from SMU to UNC Chapel Hill to Ravenscroft to some public schools, some private schools. And, you know, what I really started to process, and even when I brought some of this to Habitat for Humanity over in Asia, is, okay, leading self and leading with others were standard elements. It maps to emotional intelligence. There's so many other things that you can do around mapping that. And so we're like, okay, leading self, leading with others. And there needs to be an element of learning. And so we're like, okay, those were the earlier iterations that used to be in there. Understand self to lead self, understand others to lead. So we need to have some of that learning built in. And Chris just explained some of the other ways that we started to frame it. And then I started to process. I said, you know what? Something that young people always say on every single evaluation is, can we have more experiential activities when we're doing this?
Yep.
And it's just, oh my God, we're like, okay. And when I was ramping up facilitators to train and scale this work through Habitat's youth build work over in Asia, we had to ramp up these facilitators, and we pushed them into practice early to facilitate some of the content. And that quick little feedback loop helped them start to use the language, helped them pull their own life experiences into how they'd explain this. And it just supercharged the learning.
Yep.
And so as we started thinking about all of this, Chris said, practice. We need practice. And what we were doing too with the Habitat Youth Build is we were looking at the strategic sustainable development goals from the UN, and there's 21 that are out there. And we're like, you know what? Young people get involved in this. They will start to think of themselves as a leader when it's relevant to them. And so how do we have them look into the environment and find something that they might be passionate or at least interested in, or one of their friends is doing this and say, hey, come on along with me. And then what happens with a young person is they start to, and this happens with adults too, is you find something that's motivating you. And you're like, oh, wow, this is interesting. I want to do this better. I want to create more of an impact. And then they start backward stepping actually through the framework, if you want to use slope. So it's like you're looking in the environment, you're like, oh, wow, this is really cool. I need to do this better. So I need to practice it more. And then it's, oh, crap, I need to do this with other people better. And so it's now I'm talking about leading with others. And oh, I might need to learn some other stuff to partner with people, but also about the topic we're talking about. And all of that points you all the way back down into, okay, how do I lead myself better to do all of this? Yep. And what we've also learned with young people, and this plays out too with young boys, I think a little bit more, is that young people often don't want to raise their hand to be a leader because they don't want to boss their friends around. They don't want to wear the kind of yoke of responsibility, not all of them. And so there's just a lot of reasons why they don't want to step into that. But here's the other secret that we learned, and I learned this because of CCL's research and work, the DAC framework, direction, alignment, commitment. And what that does for young people is it helps them think about, oh, yes, I need to lead myself. And how do I apply DAC to my context, my role, and everything else? But then it also peeled it out into leadership as a social process. And so by having people think about, especially young people, think about, oh, I don't need to be the leader, but I can contribute to this, it turns it more into that team sport, of which then they're a player in there. And so that all of a sudden invites people in just like a cause or a motivation that I can do something here. And, oh, I can do this with other people and I don't need to be the boss. I'm contributing to it. So there's multiple layers in there that said, okay, how do we package this into slope so that it can be a blueprint that gets out there to educators as a simple way that they can use and modify it, or to the buckets that Chris is talking about. It's what within my class or my school or as a parent, what buckets do I need to fill for my young person, or does my program need to make sure that they're hitting?
I co-founded an organization in 2015 called the Collegiate Leadership Competition. And the whole purpose of that was, can we get students to practice leadership? Can we create a practice field? Why do people practice? My daughters are at rehearsal right now. They're in Seussical this weekend, so to compete or to perform. And so can we create an excuse for people to get together and practice? We actually had a few independent schools, high schools on the East Coast participate for a couple years. But yes, how do you create a context where people can practice this and actually reflect on it, get to know themselves a little bit better, under stress, see how they behave, see how the team behaves, create an environment where we can give one another feedback in an authentic and constructive way. And yes, to all of these, self-connecting with others, the social aspect of all of this, learning as just a through line for life, and practice. And then, of course, yeah, we're doing this in a context. And there's, in many ways, purpose behind it, but also and Chris, you said it beautifully, some of these contextual shifts impact how we do the work. Chris, what else do you want to add, sir?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, loving this. I think we also added kind of elements that amplify your program success, and as another part of this blueprint for educators and parents to think about, because this really came out of a lot of Joel's work at the CCL and his learning as he worked at institutions. But we call it BEST. So if you want slope, you got your buckets, you got to fill them. But if you want it to be the best slope, All right. There's these four elements you think about, and that's beliefs about leadership. So you can have someone like, I'm still shocked, Scott, like you said, about the mental models that adults have around leadership and how they think some kids have it and some kids don't. And I see that as toxic. We want our work to be open source. We're not interested in like making a profit off of branding this because we really think everybody needs this. We don't believe that like some kids have it and some kids don't. We think it's part of everybody's learning journey. But if you're a teacher in a classroom and you're doing your best to raise everyone and develop them as leaders, but the teacher next door is giving a different message about, oh, some kids got it and some kids don't. And by the way, who's the authority on that? That teacher, they know who has it and who doesn't, which is totally a different kind of loaded thing. But it's the beliefs about leadership across the organization, across your family that need to get examined. And so that's the B. The E is ethics. I think it's really important that we, practically speaking, we incorporate ethics into our leader development. But a lot of times in the models, they get intertwined. And I think that it's worth calling out ethics as a separate component, as something that you need to develop and then intertwine on the programmatic level. And how I think we can be clearer about where our ethics come from and how we're getting to that point. I'm excited to see that kind of shift in society, people more willing to talk about that. But if you're not doing some sort of ethical development along with leader development, just stop, because we can make the wrong types of leaders and for a world we don't want to live in. The S is strength. You have assets in your family, you have assets in your school or your community. How can you utilize those? You don't need to do something incredibly different, right? The idea is make this easy for people. You don't need to say, oh, I need to go to China on a trip to have the experiences that Chris's students have. No, we happen to be in China for a variety of reasons. So we will utilize the strengths of our community and our environment, and every community and environment has those strengths and those opportunities. So how can you lean into those to enhance what you're doing with slope? And then the last thing, the T, might be the most important, Scott. We call it threads of intention. So how can you pull intentionality into what you do? I see teachers in a classroom who are able to take an activity that they've taught for a number of years, and it hasn't been a leader development exercise. But then they look at it through an intentional lens of leader development, and it becomes a leadership development activity. And that's great news for teachers because they don't want another program, but they can talk about Lord of the Flies through a leader development lens, and they've already been teaching Lord of Flies for years. And so that's really helpful for educators. And ultimately, it's intentionality we think will lead to leader self-efficacy in kids. This will lead to motivation to lead. This will lead to practice, which will lead to increased capacity for leadership to solve the complex problems of our world. And that's our basic premise for the work.
Again, whether it's the tennis team or the ski team or theater or Lord of the Flies or gaming. My son is a gamer at times, and there's all kinds of lessons that if we were to look at it through a certain lens, so many conversations, so much opportunity, history, political science, it's all around us, literally, if we look at it through that lens. I love that. I really do.
Yeah, Scott, I loved your podcast a little while ago when you had John McGuire and Chuck Paulus on about vertical development. So many mutual friends here, but vertical development is also really critical to weave into this conversation. So we have to think about the adult. There are so many good teachers in the world. And how do we make sure and help them continue to learn and grow on their leadership journey? Because we have an interdependent world, and we need to help people be prepared for that interdependent world. But sometimes in different spaces, whether it's a coach or whether it's a classroom or whether it's a parent, these mindsets that sometimes adults have, if they are in that dependent continuum across Torbert's 7 logics, they are not going to be able to help somebody grow to have the skills or mindsets for the interdependent world. And that's same at a manager level in a corporation, right?
Yep.
Or a leader. So it's like we have to integrate the vertical leadership development approach here for the adults. So earlier when I was talking about how do we have a framework and a common language, it's also how do we have those common belief structures that Chris has talked about in that best approach. So I've really taken an organizational development approach to some of the work in schools because we have to think of that entire ecosystem. So what I loved about the work that we did at Ravenscroft is pre-K through 12, CCL and a team of us went on in there to train and develop the capacity of every adult in that system. We spent time with board members. We spent time with educators. We spent time with some of the facilities staff members and everything so that everyone in there was learning and growing so that any interaction that was happening was hopefully being modeled as a way to think about how can somebody lead from here? And that's the name of their framework. But that vertical component of helping people be able to go from me to we is the biggest challenge we face in this world today. And so how do we get that to people younger and how do we get it to everyone?
And I think if you design it well, I wrote a paper with Dave Rush a while back, and we were exploring this whole notion of, I know that people like this language and don't like this language for listeners. We're going to call it vertical and horizontal. So I can be teaching you some content about leadership, but we can also help design in a way where your cognitive complexity is also elevated, right? So we can build in critical reflection. We can build in opportunities where I'm being challenged just outside of my comfort zone, that old challenge and support. And so we can design it in a way where we create that holding environment, as Heifetz would say, that facilitates both. And how cool is that? I think that's wizard-like design. That's what we should call the model here, wizard-like design.
Yeah, and when we think about some of those teachers that we've loved or hated, some teachers will help us and teach us how to think, right?
Yes.
And others will tell us what to think, right? And so we want to think about how can teachers help us how to think, because that helps us learn and grow.
Gentlemen, as we wind down our time together today, I think I would love to go to each one of you. Chris, maybe we'll start with you. What's the practical wisdom in this conversation? What stands out for you?
The practical wisdom is leader development doesn't need to be overly complex. Start with what you have available. We hope that we provide Best Slope as a blueprint, a way to think through these things. But the key is to have kids start early and start practicing. And it's okay that they mess up. This is a journey for all of us. It's never complete. So don't hesitate for having all kids and try leadership in some form of another.
And I love the fact that you all are experimenting as well. It's invaluable. Joel?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes back to belief-driven behaviors, and we're on a journey for young people and for adults. How do we keep that in mind, whether we're the ones working with a young person or whether it's a young person that is still on their development journey? So it's like we're all still learning and growing, and hopefully our beliefs continue to mature and grow on our journey. How do we play the long road with all of these young people, plant the seeds that help them germinate, and do that with our colleagues too, because it does take an ecosystem.
100%. Takes an ecosystem. I like that. I like that a lot. I know that the two of you have a little bit of a call. Chris, what do you think?
Well, I'm really excited for where leader development, research and practice can head in the future. I think we're at a really unique time. I came into this from K-12 education. I knew little about the field, which had been focused on adults and then trickled down to college. But as I listened to your podcast and heard your guests, I think we're at a really critical inflection point for the field. And I'm excited by what I hope we can build out for K-12, because we are incredibly focused on pedagogy already in K-12, and we're already attuned to developmentally appropriate stages for kids, and that spans into adult. So I think if we can get this right, like those building blocks of leader development and the different constructs and what they look like at different life stages and how to best teach that. And that's not as big of a challenge in K-12, I think, as it is in adult or college, because we've got kids for 12 or 15 years theoretically in our system.
Yes.
So if we come with this lens of, okay, we can build this developmental journey for a kid, I'm excited if we can get some help on that. And people who are willing not to make it a branded item, but willing to just share and have the mentality that we want this to be open for everyone. Everyone has the ability and access to leader development. If we can do that, I think it can in turn inform the adult and collegiate research spaces, which we've learned so much from.
To your point, it's the closest thing to the military that we're going to get. And by that, I mean, we have time. We have time. There's a luxury of time here. And the military has a period of time to develop these people into generals or into colonels, whatever it is. And of course, there's developmentally appropriate education that's happening there. Not that the military is perfect, not that they do it perfect, but they've got time. And in a lot of these programs that we're doing in colleges, and especially once we get into corporate, which is where a lot of my time is right now, you get a half day, you get 1 day. And that's like literally sending me to a cooking class for a day or a course on piloting. Do you want me to fly a plane after that day course on piloting? No, I am not a pilot. So I think that is one of the most precious currencies in how you all are thinking, is that time. And if we scaffold that, if we prioritize that, and I love your notion also of aligning with. I don't know that it has to be an add-on, but Lord of the Flies is a beautiful book to examine some concepts and through the lens of leadership.
We'd love help, I'd say, on that. I lead a school, I'm a head of school. I'm passionate about this topic, but you have practical things you have to do as well. So if people are interested and willing to engage, we would love to partner with others to advance this work in the PK-12 space.
I'm going to put your information in the show notes, and maybe we can put the paper in there as well. Is that a possibility, you all? Okay, perfect. So we'll have a link to the paper as well. And if you all are interested in exploring a space that's a very important space, a space that's ripe for innovation and discovery, these are two gentlemen who are partners in that endeavor. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for stopping by. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Scott. This was great.
Thanks, Scott.
You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.